Welcome to our lecturette, The Culture Concept. Our learning objectives for culture concept are to uncover the basis for the nurture in the nature versus nurture debate. If we become human beings by being nurtured, what is the shape and form of our social learning? What were some of the early conceptions of human culture? And after reading the article Notes on a Balinese Cockfight, we'll examine one approach to understanding culture by interpreting the public signs and symbols that represent societies. Reading culture like a text that can be understood by an insightful reader. Our specific learning objectives for this lecturette part 1 in text reading will be to describe the primary characteristics of culture and how this key construct has evolved in the imagination of anthropologists through time, to define key ideas and concepts in the understanding of what entails culture, and to evaluate how globalization is transforming culture. Again, after this lecturette part 1, you'll want to read chapter 2 of Cultural Anthropology. I'm just basically going to orient you on the reading for that chapter. Our Socrative forum discussions today, and for these, please prepare a written response for these 2 questions after watching this lecturette parts 1 and 2. About 100 words for a 2-point question. Keep in mind you will prepare your answers before taking the Socrative quiz on a word pad or something like that, just in case the internet goes down while you're putting those answers into the Socrative website. Please keep in mind there are no right or wrong answers, only good arguments that use and apply quotes and specific examples from the readings. Use the letters A or B to help me determine which question you responded to. A, corporate culture versus counterculture. Watch the video clip from How to Succeed in Business Without Really Trying and the film clip of Santana from the documentary film Woodstock, both contained in our web links and media book on our Moodle page. Compare and describe the visual and oral culture of what you see. Clothes, ethnic makeup of the characters, music. These are 2 views of American culture that differ only by 2 years. Interpret what was changing in youth culture in America by analyzing the changing symbols and sensations represented in these 2 film clips and resourcing your own historical knowledge. And B, the McDonaldization of the world. Currently, the franchise of McDonald's is in every region of the world. In places like Oman in the Middle East, families go out to dinner to McDonald's as an event for the evening. However, fast food is also creating a health epidemic globally as people eat more fried food and far more sugar. Using quotes and key concepts from our text and media like hegemony, agency, etc. to answer the following questions. Do you think American liberal thinking goes a little overboard trying to help prevent the world from eating one of the products that we produce in the U.S.? Are we neglecting human agency here, the right for an individual to choose what to do with their food? What are your thoughts on semi-harmful products and the U.S. distribution of them, like sugary drinks, processed and fried food, tobacco? What should be done, or should anything be done about the U.S. culpability for ensuring the use of these products worldwide? We do have some key terms for this lecturette that you'll want to know thoroughly. And these terms are on pages 68 and 69 in our course text, Cultural Anthropology. Remember that capitalized words are key concepts that we'll divulge here in this lecturette that you probably will not find in the book. But these words in bold, you will find in the course glossary. What is in the significance of a greeting? So here we have 3 different greetings. And we could all say that, yes, these are indeed greetings, but one thing is missing for sure, right? The context of that greeting. So here we have sort of, it looks like to me a formal greeting. It looks like it's in France. She's doing the 3 air kiss on the cheeks right here. It could be in Belgium or even Switzerland or wherever the French culture has sort of incorporated itself into. We have a little Asian girl here probably saying namaste and greeting, could be a stranger, could be even family, we don't know. And here, yes, of course, we have a Brazilian greeting, and we all know that the context of this is very different from the other contexts. Culture is about context, and we all have some limited, albeit limited, but good abilities at interpreting that in visual and oral mediums. How has culture concept developed in anthropology? Well, we're going to start this topic rather, and the next topic we will be going into a little bit more of social theory The concept of culture really started with the early evolutionary frameworks, the social Darwinism. We talked about this in our last topic, our introductory topic for the course. We also talked about how it changed with Franz Boas, with his idea of historical particularism, that no single society basically was biologically evolved, it was culturally evolved. It had a historical background and culture that went back perhaps sometimes eons, that really explained the logic of the particular rituals of any one society. In the next few weeks we'll be looking at Malinowski and structural functionalism, and basically what he says is that there's a logic to the way people do, and sometimes it's contradictory to what people say they are doing. And finally, this week we're doing culture and meaning, how to interpret symbolic meanings and oral meanings in what we see around us in culture and come up with a deeper context for those visuals. A contemporary of Henry Louis Morgan, Edward Burnett Tyler, who was the first academic to really define the discipline of anthropology and call himself an anthropologist in Great Britain, defined culture in 1871 as this: culture or civilization is that complex whole which includes knowledge, belief, art, law, customs, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by man as a member of society. Now, one thing to recognize in this definition is civilization. In other words, he is equating culture with civilization, indicating that there's some sort of social Darwinist perspective that he is talking about, meaning that we have lower forms of culture and higher forms of culture according to how civilized you are, right? Here's a good definition from Kroeber and Klucomb, a consensus on culture that became much more psychological by 1952. And they said culture consists of patterns, explicit and implicit, behavior acquired and transmitted by symbols, constituting the distinctive achievements of human groups, including their embodiments and artifacts. The essential core of culture consists of traditional, that is, historically derived and selected, ideas, and especially attached values. That's so important, attached values. Culture systems may, on the one hand, be considered as products of actions, on the other hand, as conditioning elements of further actions. In other words, our actions determine our culture, but our culture also determines our actions. Much more psychological. Here's my stripped down definition of human culture you can take with you and relate to people over coffee. Culture is learned, shared ideas about, and patterns of human behavior. Your book's author, Kenneth Guest, really goes into a really good definition of culture, explaining that culture touches and affects virtually every aspect of our life. That culture is learned and taught and shared, yes, yet also individually contested. That's very important, I think, to mention as well. We all aren't homogenized by culture. We react as well to culture. It's also symbolic, according to Geertz, and material, and encompassing norms, values, symbols. And one other thing I'm going to mention is mental maps of reality and schemas, which the book really doesn't go into. And we'll be talking about schemas a little bit further. It also bridges cultural naivete in the first encounter with a foreign society. And what I mean by that last comment is, if you ever want to know how different your own society and culture are, go someplace else very, very exotic and stay there for a year or two, and you'll discover just how naive your conceptions of what normal was in your own society. Let's discuss how culture and power are related, which is much more important than it used to be for anthropologists. So, power and cultural institutions are framed by a post-structuralist approach, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. Another thing that is mentioned, another word, key concept rather, is mentioned in our book this week is hegemony, which is a neo-Marxist or new Marxist term. And the definition of hegemony is the ability of a dominant group to create consent and agreement within a larger population without the overt threat of force. Does that sound familiar? Another key concept is human agency. The power, page 52 rather, the power of individuals and groups to contest cultural norms, values, symbols, and structures of power. Does that also sound like something that's going on today? Well, let's look at a case study of Charlottesville, Virginia. And let me ask you, what was the relationship between power and the cultural institutions at this event? What was the cultural symbolism of the Confederate statues? What role did hegemony play at Charlottesville in the building of those statues? And what role does human agency play? And I'll withhold discussing these until we get into our actual discussion forum. This week would also be a really good week to start to determine how we are developed, the human beings, by our own biology or by our own culture. In other words, enculturated. So biological patterns versus cultural patterns. Some behaviors are undoubtedly have biological roots. For example, both smiles and kissing are nearly universal among human populations. Although, as my girlfriend points out from Indonesia, when you kiss somebody in Indonesia, she just showed me this morning, you also give them a smell, which is probably be considered kind of rude in the United States. And similar behaviors, though, have been witnessed in our nearest living relatives, the chimpanzees. But as we have seen, not all kisses are alike and are very much informed by cultural context. Some of these issues I'd like to talk about in our discussion, nature versus nurture, are very specific. For instance, let's debate alcoholism. Is alcoholism biological or developmental? Let's talk about what your opinions are of that and some of the recent evidence in our discussion. If we do believe that culture determines what we are through development, from learning, etc., then what's the method that culture comes into us, the enculturation process? Well, there's a good deal of evidence that support that. Part of that is defined by what we call schemas. In psychology, it's a cluster of ideas and associations that can be outlined for understanding explicit human behavior. Think of a schema as a way of quantifying culture, as a way for the human mind to program information by practicing learned routines and understandings. So we all form schematic maps from how we are enculturated in society. They're so intuitive we don't even think about it, right? But they enable an ethnographer to document a cultural set of ideas by looking at all the important associations that go into how a person maps their world cognitively. For instance, I've seen this in research. A man walks into a bar at 12 noon, mapping what he goes through. He looks in, sees his usual seat, sits down. A bartender brings him his super cold Budweiser in a koozie. His bar routine outlines his schema, his schematic map and cultural behavioral routine laid out in a series of decisions based upon habits and personal orientations. So let's do a little schematic exercise for you, and then we'll bring this up in discussion. Tell me what you see. What does this say about your schema, for instance, is what I'm going for in these 3 photos. So take some time, and during our discussion, I'd like to ask you very specific questions. What is going on with your cultural interpretation of this event here? Who is he in relation to all these people? What's the mood? What's the setting? What's going on? And this, what is going on in this scene to you? Have you ever seen this before? Tell me about your own experiences. How would you interpret this? And finally, this scene, what's going on in this scene? Have you ever been in this scene before? Tell me about your own experiences, what you think, and then what you can interpret about what's going on. Remember that there's this man back here as well. How is culture created through global mediums? Well, let's go to how culture is created through micromediums, first of all. The micromedium is really enculturation, which is the process by which a child or adult learns the ideas and behaviors that constitute his or her own culture. So that's how we manufacture, for instance, the desire to consume goes from a macro level to a micro level. So let's talk about how culture is created through a global medium, advertising. Think about this: financial services and credit. Credit cards are found throughout our lives today. They actually only began to grow in popularity about 40 years ago. Believe it or not, 50 years ago, no one had a credit card, right? Now we have people around the world in debt, right? How did that happen? Well, of course, we manufactured a desire to consume through our advertising and our worldwide advertising, and we have created an entire world full of debtors for the benefit of financial services institutions. How is globalization transforming culture? Well, globalization has a homogenizing effect. I don't think there's any doubt about that. As new generations and younger populations grow up, there's a diminution of older tradition, an increasingly global outlook. But I say diminution because it's basically a re-emphasis into modern technologies, right? Modern culture, more Western forms of culture. It's not necessarily the distinguishing or ellipse of any one culture. It's the diminution or decreasing emphasis of part of their old traditions, perhaps. But also, there is a two-way transference of culture. You know, for instance, the Mayans are coming. New York used to not have a single Mexican restaurant, while LA had thousands of them, right? Now, believe it or not, New York has lots of Mexican restaurants. So Mexican culture and those more traditional types of living in the Americas are spreading into very cosmopolitan places in the United States, and they're changing our outlook here. This is called in cosmopolitanism, an increasing cosmopolitan or shared cultural exchanges around the world, and increasing the awareness of belonging to a global community. Even the most remote corners of the world today, people who are aware of global issues going around. Now, there is a reaction, though, against cosmopolitan, and this is fundamentalism, where people want to stop and go back to a shared imagination of the past and recreate that in the present. Again, this fundamentalism, though, this is an imagination of the past, and sometimes it's quite clearly not what really was their legacy in historic terms. I do have to make kind of a bigger point about culture and difference. Before we go too far on this semester, Clyde Klucom and Henry Murray once remarked that in some respects every person is like every other person. In other respects, every person is different from every other person. In some respects, some people are like other people. How do we differentiate among ourselves in America? In the US, do you see differences in yourself and others first? Or do you see similarities in yourself and others first? Are you really Republican or Democrat, or is it really a question of degree, ideology, and approach? So, how different are you from your siblings? Do you think there is a world of difference between you and your parents or siblings, and yet other people see only similarities between you? Do you have the same voice, outlook, habits than your brothers and sisters do? Stories about that? I have to tell you that when we're really close to people that are very similar to us, we can't see it. You know, usually what we see are all the egregious differences between us. And that's what we tend to focus on in human beings. We can never really see the sameness, the universality in our conditions. And I think I should preface the rest of the semester with that. We are all much more the same than we are different. Right now would be a good time to take a break. And I hope my snoring dog isn't bothering your viewing and listening pleasure. Remember to read chapter 2 then after this part 1 segment. Welcome back to our lecturette part 2 of the culture concept. The reading you want to do after this lecturette is Clifford Geertz' Read Deep Play Notes on a Balinese Cockfight in your course reader or in the Moodle research file. It's 27 pages long. It's one of the longer readings, which is why this segment and this particular topic is a little bit shorter. Our specific learning objectives for this lecturette will be to begin to understand interpreting the deeper meanings behind the visual and oral expression of culture, to analyze culture from a method of observing and interpreting what we see, to evaluate some of the limitations of encapsulating a view of a society from one person's perspective. Let me orient you on this reading. So, Clifford Geertz emphasizes symbolic interpretive theories, which emphasize deeper meanings and cultural translations to explain social phenomena and behavior. Deep Play Notes on a Balinese Cockfight is an essay included in his book, The Interpretation of Culture. It's considered the most seminal work of Geertz, and the essay addresses the meaning of cockfighting in Balinese culture. Cockfights were generally illegal in Indonesia when Geertz was doing his fieldwork there in the 1950s. The essay describes how cocks are taken to stand in for powerful men in the villages and notes that even the double entendre sense of the word cock exists in the Balinese language as much as it is in English. Last half of the essay describes the rituals of betting and concludes that the cockfight is the Balinese comment on themselves, as it embodies the network of social relationships in kin and village that govern traditional Balinese life. So it's a story about, the cockfight is a story about themselves in a sense. The title of the essay is explained as a concept by Jeremy Bentham, who defines deep play as a game with stakes so high that no rational person would engage in it. There are some larger implications for Geertz's view of culture and some contestations, I would say. Interpretation versus multivocality, for instance. Geertz draws out the hidden significance of public events, but there has been criticism of his approach on two fronts. Postmodernists say, and we'll learn what that is next week in full, that his interpretations of events is biased because it is alone and it comes from a uniquely Western perspective. Geertz's anthropology is perhaps a high point in finding sameness in different societies, comparing, for instance, Macbeth to a Balinese cockfight. Are the two really comparable, or is he just being illustrative? His perspective is also quite culturally relativistic. No value judgments for the brutality of the act against nature are being talked about. Cultural materialists say he delves too much into meanings and games of events and not enough of the material motives of those involved. I mean, after all, this is a betting game. How can we account for our own bias when interpreting events for ourselves and others? How can we produce truth in a more holistic manner rather than this is going to be the quest of this course in part. Let's apply Geertz's approach to U.S. culture and compare two visions of American culture from 1967 and 69 to describe what we are seeing in terms of deciphering the deeper meanings of visual and oral culture in the United States. Let's look at a clip from Robert Morse from the film version of the Broadway play How to Succeed in Business Without Really Trying from 1967. And let's look at the clip of Carl Santana at the Woodstock Festival, July 1969. I'm going to ask you in our discussion, what is your interpretation, your deep reading of what is occurring in these two videos? Compare and contrast the cultures you are seeing and hearing. You'll be ready to take our topic quizzes after you've completed watching this lecturette and all the videos in our web and video link book. Scanning over the web links, of course, as well. After completing the reading for this topic, and remember, 2-point questions are about 100 words. I do have one 4-point question here, about 150 words. The reading again was Clifford Geertz, Deep Play, Notes on a Balinese Cockfight, in Chapter 2 of Cultural Anthropology. So answer all parts of the following questions for your Socrative quiz with concise, accurate responses. Also, I'm looking for proof that you engage the course web, media, and reading. So please use concrete examples from the course materials and prepare your answers to paste into our Socrative quizzes. Please number and letter each of your responses so I know which one you're answering and I'm not confused about which one you're answering. I mark you wrong for it. So reflect on both of the Socrative form discussion questions and answer them in about 100 words or so. And A, corporate culture versus counterculture. Watch the video clip from How to Succeed in Business Without Really Trying and the film clip of Santana from the documentary film Woodstock. And compare and describe the visual and oral culture of what you see, clothes, makeup, etc. These two views of American culture differ only by 2 years. Again, interpret what was changing in youth culture in America by analyzing the changing symbols and sensations represented in these two film clips and resourcing your own historical knowledge. And B, the McDonaldization of the world. Currently, the franchise of McDonald's is in every region of the world. In places like Oman and Kuwait in the Middle East, families go out to dinner to McDonald's as an event for the evening. However, fast food is also creating a health epidemic globally as people eat more fried food and far more sugar. That is occurring in Mexico right now, for instance. After quickly reviewing the official trailer for the movie, The Founder, in our web links and media file, after reading Chapter 2 in Cultural Anthropology, using quotes and key concepts from our text and media, including hegemony and agency, those concepts, answer the following question, Do you think America liberal thinking is going a little overboard, trying to prevent the world from eating one of the products that we produce in the U.S.? Are we neglecting human agency here, the right for an individual to choose? What are your thoughts on semi-harmful products and the U.S. distribution and advertising of them worldwide? Selling like sugar drinks, for instance, processed food and fried food, tobacco. What should be done about this, or should anything be done about the U.S. culpability for ensuring the use of these products worldwide? And number 2, take a quote from Deep Play, Notes on a Balinese Cockfight, that resonates with you. Paste it into the answer space and describe how that quote speaks to Geertz's approach and method, how his method of reading culture might be used to better understand global societies or cultural attitudes represented in public arenas and streets of other societies. Tell me where it might fail as well. For instance, is it too narrow a point of view for one person to be a cultural translator of exotic rituals and visual behaviors? Go to the implications for Clifford Geertz, that particular slide, for some help there. Be specific, though, with your points and argument. Look at the implication, like I said, of Geertz's research slide for that help. What kind of visual symbols and clues to your own hometown can you think of that would help you define the place where you come from? Give us a clue about what kind of shops do they have there? What kind of visuals? What kinds of things are people wearing ordinarily? What would clue you in about the culture of your hometown? So give us a little sample of the place you're from.